Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon, and I'm the host of a Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Hello, everybody.
And welcome to the podcast. In every Toolkit episode, we try to bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. It's all about helping you develop as a professional, where you make the choices that affect you in your classroom for the betterment of your students. And we hope to open some doors for you as you make those choices. It's about using the fullness of the Australian curriculum and using wonderful children's literature as a central part of your teaching. Great teaching can never be packaged into a program, we believe. And welcome newcomers to the podcast, and please join our Teachers Toolkit Facebook group if you haven't already. Now, Sharon, I've been busy putting up on our website lots of poetry
Yes.
that you've been sourcing.
Yes.
That's public domain poetry.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So with our little series of podcasts,
Yep.
our trio of podcasts around poetry, I'm always collecting poetry. So it was nice to be able to hand you a whole lot of poetry that could go up in one big collection. So I think there's over 70 poems that we've put up there, mostly for our younger.
Yeah, up to about year 4 and 5, but there are some that could be used in older grades, but mostly for the younger grades.
Yes, yeah.
Lots,
so,
over 70 poems, I think.
Yeah. And I guess it just shows, that it's always that, we collect, as, it doesn't just come in one big flurry of, but in reading over time. So that's probably representative of about 6 months worth of collecting poems.
Yep.
Which
we encourage teachers to do their own collecting. And there's lots of sources, aren't there?
Yes. And we hope that the website is also a place where people know they can go browsing.
Yeah. Reading,
browsing, and hopefully finding some poems that speak to them to bring to their class.
So in the show notes, there'll be links to that, and anything else we mention that's a resource in the podcast, we'll try and put links on there for you in the show notes. But we're really excited today to have a great educator and author, Alan Wright, on the show. Sharon, would you like to introduce Alan?
So first of all, well, actually, I can hear Alan's already in the background, so we should say hello to Alan.
Yes. Hello, Alan.
Hello and welcome.
Hello, both of you. Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. Importantly, because in this sort of little trio of podcasts that we've been doing about poetry that kicked off with Paul Kelly talking about his anthology of poetry, as well as how poetry's influenced him, and both in his personal life and in his career as singer, performer, writer. And our second podcast was really more about, reading like a writer and bringing the writer's workshop idea to teachers.
Yeah, and trying to embed the poetry into your teaching.
Yes.
And make it an ongoing, not just a unit of poetry. That was a big focus of that last one.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then this podcast, it's so wonderful to have you here, Alan, because you're so active in this field as both an education consultant and an author, and you've worked extensively across Australia and Is America the United States, probably not your only international?
No, well, the work that I've had, contact I've had with writers and poets in England has mainly been online, but it's predominantly, as you said, across Australia and the United States.
Yes, and you work across primary and middle and high schools.
Correct.
So
yes.
This is the richness, everybody, today of this podcast is, you really talking about poetry across all of those year levels, as well as I know you'll also touch on poetry not just for children, but poetry for us as teachers, what that means, what that really means for us. And you have your own education consultancy, Alvic, that people will be able to find you,
we'll show the links.
As well as I know your blog Living Life Twice, but I think you might have a couple of other blogs.
I do. I have. I've been quite busy in that area. I have a poetry blog called Putting Pizzazz into Poetry, and I also have a Facebook page which is also called Living Life Twice. So that sort of gives quite a bit of breadth to I guess reaching out and making contact and supporting, in particular, teachers of writing and poetry. The Living Life Twice blog is now, it's interesting, it started way back in 2008. So I'm, from something that started very small and quite humbling, has grown into, I guess, a source of support and hopefully some inspiration for teachers of writing.
Yes, so very active in that field as you are in schools, working with teachers and students, as well as presenting at conferences. And then I want to just wrap up with, apart from all of your blogs and Facebook platforms, there are 4 books that teachers may or may not have come across, but Igniting Writing, When a Teacher Writes, is such a great book because it's really about how we as teachers, as writers, can impact our students.
Yes, it was an interesting book because I was approached actually on this occasion to write a book for teachers about writing, and I said to my wife Vicky, where do I begin? And she said, you've already written the book, it's in your writer's notebooks across the years, you just need to go back in and I guess do some excavating. And she was quite right. She was quite right, and yes, I'm quite proud of that particular book. That sort of kicked things off for me.
Yes.
And as a consequence, well, actually prior to that, I believe it or not, I'd been writing musicals for schools. So I'd had a number of musicals published, and it was interesting listening to your podcast with Paul Kelly and talking about the connection between poetry and music. And in writing those musicals, particularly the lyrics for the songs and the script itself, working with a musician in terms of creating the music for that, it was an interesting collaboration. So the process, as Paul was pointing out when he spoke to you, can be quite different in different situations. And I always think of Elton John and Bernie Taupin. They were never necessarily in the same room or the same town, and yet one did the lyrics and the other did the music, and it all came together. So this whole thing of the processes that we go through is constantly fascinating to me. I just love it. And we can't talk about the process, we've got to talk about our processes, because it differs from writer to writer.
And I think that's just such a key point and I know we'll explore that today, that there isn't a process for any of this. It is about exploration, and it is a real journey of exploring, rather than it having any constraint, any particular framework. But this whole notion of crafting and exploring and trying and immersing and all of those things, I know you'll give us a whole lot more about that shortly. I just want to also mention your 3 books on poetry. Yes. So we had Paul Kelly's anthology. You've got your What the Poemster Found. Have I even said that right?
Yes. That's interesting that word poemster came from a small boy in a school in South Australia at Elizabeth.
Yes.
And I was waiting outside the office to find out where I had to go to talk to kids about poetry. And this little guy wandered by and he looked at me quite, sort of wondering, who the heck are you? And then he came back again a second time and he said, "Hey, mister, are you the poemster?"
Oh.
And I thought, I've never heard that word before, but what a wonderful word. So I locked it away and I thought I have to use this in some way. Yes. And so this 3rd anthology became What the Poemster Found. So it was a lovely story, and it's a story often in itself how the title of a book comes about. And of course the first one, Searching for Hen's Teeth, that came from my dad, because he was always saying those types of things to me, when small children inquire and say, "What are you doing, Dad or Mum?" And Dad used to say, "I'm searching for hen's teeth." And I'd say, "Well, no, you're not. You're sawing a piece of wood." And so that was easy. The middle one, which has quite an unusual title in that it's I Bet There's No Broccoli on the Moon, came about because of my childhood fascination with the moon, but also my lingering disagreements with eating broccoli as a child. And so I thought, how can I put these two things together? And that I'd finished that book. The title didn't come until 3 months later. So I often say to kids, it's really important that you invest time and, intellectual energy in coming up with a title that will have some sense of curiosity about it. People will want to know, what made you call it that? So titles are really important.
Oh, and here we are, Alan. You've already opened up, that caboodle box, of things that you're going to reveal and share from, the writer and the teacher's perspective. So I just wanted to. It just made me realise as you were talking about those titles, though, and even in that, that searching for hen's teeth was a phrase that your father used, is just how important those expressions that we hear and that come to be part of, our life really are actually real nuggets, aren't they, in poetry?
Most definitely. The whole notion of idiomatic language is critical, and there's a tendency for us to lose a lot of that, and it unless people are talking and using the language, well, it starts to fall away. And Robert Macfarlane, the British writer and historian, talks about that a lot. He's done a lot of work around preserving the language of various regions in the UK and Scotland. And so, yes, we have to celebrate it. We have to perpetuate it, and that way it enriches the I guess the treasury of language that we have.
Yes.
Wonderful. And I think that we might even be, I've just been looking, at what the Australian Curriculum Review for English is looking like, and I actually see the reference there, or the proposed reference there to, that very thing, preserving the languages that we have here in Australia, and the phrasings and the expressions that belong with those. And I think, yes, it's high time they are valued, caught and preserved.
Yes, well, some people will say that, there are new words obviously coming into the lexicon all the time, and there are other words that are falling away. There's in recent times, I've read the dictionary of lost words, and it was powerful in underscoring the importance of, when you hear a word, following it along and finding out where it came from. And that's been something that's been, I guess, part of my writing identity all my life. And so when I say to talk to kids, I talk about, now, if you heard me use a word then that you weren't sure of, ask me to explain it. Ask me to tell you what it means. Follow it up yourself. See what you can find out. Because it's really, really important that we build and exhibit a curiosity around words.
Fantastic. Now, we might move on to the topic today, Alan, which is embracing poetry as readers and writers. Teachers find this a bit of a struggle, do you think?
They often do, Phil, simply because they've had there's a number of things that have happened. They've either had a bad experience with poetry or they've had a very narrow experience with poetry. And I know I've presented workshops that talk about taking poetry beyond haiku and acrostics, because what happens is that they tend to stay safe and teach those forms of poetry that they feel most comfortable with. And there's not a lot of risk-taking involved, and therefore what, again, is continued is that narrow corridor that young poets are taken down rather than a broader landscape for poetry. So I think what we've got to do, first of all, is demonstrate to teachers that, if they're risk takers, their students will be risk takers. And one of the projects that I got involved in last year with Prospect North Primary School online, because in Victoria we had that protracted lockdown, and it was wonderful because the teachers there were brave and they allowed me to take the kids into new forms and new areas of poetry, and they went with them and showed their students that they were learners too. And I thought that was a powerful message. And I know at the end of it, the teachers, the feedback was that they now had a renewed confidence in how they would go about poetry, I guess, going forward, which was wonderful to hear.
So as a first step for a teacher to just start reading more widely on poetry, is that the first step?
Absolutely. Well, it's the same as for when we're presenting poetry in the classroom. It's the whole thing of immersion. And I've always loved, Mem Fox used to say, we don't immerse kids, we dunk them. Yeah. We actually push their heads under. And I have my poet suitcase, which is filled with hundreds and hundreds of poetry books. They're bulging out of it. I've got them on the shelves around me. So I've curated my own collection of poetry across a lifetime, and I'm continually looking for new examples and old examples of poetry. I'll go into secondhand bookshops and find treasure there. I'll go into new bookshops. And increasingly, it is difficult to find poetry. There are no dedicated poetry sections in most bookshops now, particularly in the children's area where it needs to be.
Yes.
And yet, and then the other thing that I do, I'm happy to make this public knowledge. When I'm visiting schools, I make a point of going into the library and quietly looking at the poetry resources. And sometimes I come away feeling quite dispirited because I get the impression that poetry stopped being collected after about 1960. And so there's a host of wonderful contemporary poetry out there that is not being accessed, and therefore kids are not getting that opportunity to see it. So there are anthologies of classical poetry, but a lot of it's old and it's tired and it's unattractive to kids. So not to say that it isn't good value poetry, it's just the way it's packaged. And so we've got to make a point of bringing poetry back into people's visual eye line. And that's one of the ways that we can do it. And we can demand from publishers that, they bring poetry texts to our schools, and that, we see poetry in bookshops. And I say to kids, and I say to teachers, and I say to parents, the next time you're visiting your local bookshop, ask them, where are the poetry books? I need to see them. There's a wonderful bookshop in Adelaide, in Walkerville.
Yes,
right.
Peggy Williams.
Yes. And I'll give them a big tick, because every time I visit Adelaide, I get to go into that bookshop, and I'm never disappointed. There are always new poetry books there for me to browse. So
Rebecca,
there are
Rebecca, who works there, came on to one of our podcasts, and we're going to have her again. But she updates us with some of the latest books that she's given.
And actually, she shared out 2 of the books. The sort of the new wave of fiction that's written in free verse.
The verse novels. Now, I have a growing collection. I think I have about 20 verse novels now, and I know this year in the shortlisted books there was Bindi by Curly Saunders, and there was also Worse Things by Sally Murphy, and I can't remember what the third one was, unfortunately. But look, it's a wonderful thing, and often when you talk to kids, they're not even aware that verse novels are there, and yet there are some fabulous verse novels that can be accessed by kids, and particularly those readers who often get a bit book shy when they look at a novel and they go, oh, I don't know whether I've got the reading stamina to deal with that. A verse novel is an attractive proposition.
Yes.
And I'm guessing humour in poetry is also a winner too, Alan. Like there's some great.
Well, yes, but I agree with American poet Nikki Grimes, who says if we only ever give kids humour, we're actually selling them short. So
good point.
In my latest book, What the Poems to Found, it is a mix of humour, but it's also some poems that I hope will provoke some thought and discussion. So there's some more serious aspects to poetry included in that, because I sort of felt that I didn't want to go, continue down a particular pathway. I wanted to change it up, and I made a point of deliberately including some poems in that collection that were, I guess, more thought-provoking.
So this leads me, we're kind of answering my next question, which is, why do we really need, what is it about poetry that we need? What is it, we're doing all these amazing collections, or we need better collections, but say we do create a great collection in our classroom, what is the purpose of poetry? I heard Paul Kelly saying that, it's amazing how little pieces of poetry stick to us, and we're able to, recite them almost at will. Yeah. And that's one of the beautiful things about poetry, is that the words sometimes endure long after the poet has left the scene. Their words have become ingrained, and we're able to recall them. And so that's part of the reason they have a special place. And of course, poetry can move us in a variety of ways. As you mentioned, it can make us laugh, it can make us cry, it certainly can be a call to action. It can be quite revolutionary in what it's trying to do. It can be a protest. So I think I think the breadth of poetry is something that helps it, but it's also unique in the way that it looks on the page and the way that it sounds in the ear, and it's evident in cultures all around the world. And one of the things that I've been doing in the last 12 months has been because I couldn't get into schools, was simply to explore different forms of poetry from different cultures, and try and come to
come to grips and feel more confident about trying a variety of other forms of poetry. So I think I know Michael Rosen talks about poetry as being suggestive, and by that he means that it suggests an idea and then leaves us to do the figuring out. And I love that idea.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that it's, and of course I get concerned about what we call poetry by autopsy, where, they pull it apart and kill it, particularly in a lot of our secondary schools. So I know I've been in classrooms. I remember being in the back of a Year 10 classroom in Baltimore, and the teacher was sucking the life out of Shakespearean sonnets, and there was a young writer sitting at the back of the room where I was, and she said, "Oh, for goodness sake, stop talking and let us do some writing of poetry." And I thought, I agree.
Yes.
I agree. So yeah, it's such a wonderful, it's such a precise and smooth way of expressing an idea. And I think that's another aspect of its uniqueness.
So we've got a purpose, but how do we now get the kids engaged with it? Like that girl saying, let us write it. How do we get it going in our classroom?
Okay. Well, believe it or not, tomorrow I'm taking a suitcase of poetry books into a school, and that's going to be the starting point, letting the kids clamber over those books, open them up on the floor, and just find out what it is that they like about poetry. What appeals to their ear? What appeals to their eye? What is it? Is it a particular subject? Is it the fact that a poet actually took the time to write about this, and I maybe had never considered it as a possible topic for a poem? But to let them then talk to one another about what they are noticing about poetry, then we will document some of those things. It's about the discoveries, and I've talked a lot about American poet Ted Kooser, who said we need to read at least 100 poems before we write one. Now, I get that notion of immersion, and it's so important. And of course, in order to do that, schools need a plentiful supply of poetry books. It keeps coming back to that particular problem. So we need to document and uncover poetry secrets. We need to write those down and collect excerpts, or if they're shorter poems, maybe we can write the whole poem out in our notebooks. One of the things that I point out to kids all the time is, if I'm writing in my notebook, which I do, continually, and that's where all my poetry begins its life. It starts there, and then I have to make decisions about which ones I want to lift out and take further. But I also collect other people's words in my notebooks, and kids and teachers sometimes forget how important that is, because there's the inspiration, there's the spark, and I can look at that and say, I want to be able to write like that. They're words that get me going, get the creative juices flowing. So it's important that when you read something that inspires you, don't lose it. Trap it, put it in your notebook, and so that you can come back and read it again, and hopefully it will be the launching pad for something of your own. Because as we know, and I heard again Paul Kelly relate to this, first we imitate and then we innovate, and it's so true. It's so true.
So the writer's notebook is a fantastic tool, a living and breathing thing that each child has that they use in their gathering ideas and a range of purposes, isn't it, Alan?
Correct, correct. Well, I mean, the other thing is that this is why I'm at pains to, suggest to teachers that they need to be writers too, because it's a journey that the inexperienced poet and the most proficient writer in that room need to go on together. And so if a teacher's trying out these things, noticing the patterns in poetry, playing with line breaks, using repetition, and then using all those literary devices like alliteration, rhyme, simile, metaphor, onomatopoeia, all of those things, and having fun with words, indulging in a bit of wordplay, then kids are more likely to say, I want to be part of this. This looks good. This looks like something that I might enjoy. And, that's the whole thing. I always think of Sharon Creech's book, Love That Dog, where the little boy was reeled into poetry by the teacher, bit by bit. And that's what we're doing. It's sort of like, putting out a fishing line and with some bait on it, and we hook them in so that they want to know more about this stuff called poetry. So that's why my notebooks are littered with, my first drafts of poems, and then often they go, oh, I've seen that in one of your books, and it's different. Yes, it is different because that's where it started out, and then it was polished.
Yeah, so we talk about doing some shared writing where the teacher's modelling it and having fun with it, either in a big book or on the board, or but with the class involved in it.
Yes. So
that's really interactive. Also a read aloud, so lots of reading aloud so that they're hearing, not necessarily... Yeah.
You're absolutely spot on, Phil. It's so important that kids hear the poetry. So sometimes when I'm introducing a poem, I'll say, first of all, I just want you to listen to the words. And then on the second reading, I'll put it up so they can actually see the words and hear it at the same time. So you're right. Shared reading and shared writing are critical components and instructional strategies to use in this situation. So, often that notion of writing in the style or writing under the influence of another writer can be highlighted through this, and then inviting the kids, well, if you like what this particular writer did, can you imagine yourself writing in this style? What is this writer doing that you wish you could do? So, and then therefore what I often do is try to write in that style and say, how did I go? Are you noticing any parallels between what writer A did and what I tried to do in my writing? So again, you're saying to them, it's okay to write in the style of another writer, particularly when you're starting out.
Yeah. And another question is, how do we embed poetry writing more regularly into the classrooms? What's the best timing? How do you see that happening?
I think it's really. I heard Sharon commenting about, I guess, the restrictive nature of a unit of poetry, and I know how frustrated I used to get with in America with the national approach to Poetry Month in April, yes. And therefore there wouldn't be any other poetry for the rest of the year. Not in every school and not in every classroom, but that was a tendency that tends to rise up when poetry is looked at this way. So I talk about embedding poetry across the day. You could start the day with a poem, you could end the day with a poem. Sometimes there are time fillers where you can, read a poem. And again, it can be just purely for the enjoyment of listening to poetry. And you can use poetry as part of an investigation, a celebration. Letting kids sort of develop performance poetry and choral reading and those sort of things. So there's lots of opportunity to make poetry permeate, the entire curriculum. I know I've written poems that have a mathematical feel to them and a scientific feel to them. So again, sometimes it's to do with sport and physical education. So you can write poetry across a range of curriculum areas. So it's it becomes more natural to be embedded across our lives and across our day, rather than being something that is cocooned into a unit of work.
Yep.
Yeah. We can think of it a little bit like if we only said informational writing only existed in 1 month. of the school
year. That would be, yes, that would be a good analogy. Definitely.
Because it's really something like any form of writing. We want our students to see that we can choose to use that for so many different, for so many different purposes.
I worked with a young teacher in Melbourne's West, and he'd embraced the idea of a writer's notebook, and he came into his grade 3 class and he said, I told them that I was writing some rap poetry.
Yes.
And he said, I shared it with them, and he said, I then realised my capacity, my power to influence. He said, because by the end of the week, I had about 10 of my students having a go at writing their own rap poetry. And when kids are given choice, voice develops. And I know often when I go into those classrooms where teachers trust kids to think and come up with their own topics and genres, often when I ask, so how many different genres would you have represented in the writing in your classroom currently? And they'll say, probably 4 or 5 different things. So there's a poetry group, and there's an informational text group, and there's a memoir group. So it's just amazing, kids making informed choices about what they want to write about. But I thought that the biggest thing was the teacher's realisation of how, if you want something to get some traction in your classroom, all you need to do is have a go at it yourself and bring it in and share it.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Great point and great example of the power of what we bring as teachers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just going back a step, Mem Fox talked about letting the author do the talking, the book do the talking, and don't interfere with it. Just let it come out. And she doesn't like to see books being dissected in.
No.
Get back to the
I what comes to mind is a quote from Ralph Fletcher, and I think he was talking about mentor texts, and he said, whatever you do, don't milk all the juice out of a book. Save a little bit for next time. And that's true. You really need to let the book do its own talking. Mind you, I'll sometimes talk about, because kids will say to me, what new books have you got? What are you reading at the moment? And I love that. And so I make a point of sharing some of the new books that I've acquired, between visits. And I'll often just share a small snippet or some little reason as to why I chose that book. And that's often enough, because the next time the next visit they'll say, did you bring that book you had last week? I'd really like to read that. Or I found that book in our library, and so they follow up, and it's almost like a poetry tasting. You just give them a little, enough to arouse curiosity about a text, and away they go.
Yeah.
But then also in the classroom, giving them the time to read poetry and the time to write it.
Critical.
Should be the majority of the time. Like that girl was complaining about, the teacher was talking and she wasn't getting any time to write.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, in every writing workshop, as we know, the majority of the time should be kids and teachers writing, that's vital, because it's in the practice that we improve. It's not in the, we gain some, deeper understanding through discussion and talk. But I often say, look, it's really important to quarantine talk. We certainly need to talk before we write, and we certainly, it's critical that we talk after we have written. But while we are writing, we really need to have that cone of silence around us so that we can, give our cognitive energy to, bringing our best words onto the page. And I love that expression about, keep writing until your best words appear. I think that's so important, and therefore the notion of developing writing stamina in the same way that we develop reading stamina is vital.
So
vital, that understanding.
So you're going to need, before they go into that independent time, they're going to need some mini lesson on an aspect of writing that, the teacher wants to focus on, which they can then practice in their independent time. Is that the way you see it operating?
Oh,
Alan?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I often will highlight an aspect of poetry or whatever it may be that we're doing. I show them sometimes part of my process in doing that. And of course, you'll get rebuffed. There'll be kids who say, look, I'm doing this other piece of writing at the moment. That's fine. Good. Go for it. But if those of you that want to give this a try today, there it is for you. And the other thing that's important about teaching aspects of writing, it may not be taken up today, but it will be taken up. Yeah. It will be taken up and it will emerge. And, I know across my teaching career, I've sometimes waited a month. And suddenly, something will come up and say, remember when we were talking about this? And I've almost forgotten about it, but it emerges. It's like a seed pushing through the concrete.
Yes.
And
probably
there it is.
Oh, sorry, keep going.
No, I was just going to say, and there it is. It starts to emerge into the light, and so it's not wasted. It's not wasted.
No, I think that's such a good point, that it doesn't have to, the time for it to be used does emerge. It doesn't have to happen instantly. It doesn't have to have a place to live at that moment, just because we said, we've brought it to them.
Teachers often laugh when I say, look, nobody comes to my front door, knocks on it and says, Alan, here's your topic for the day. I never wake up thinking, gee, today I feel like writing an expository text.
Yeah.
It's about ideas, and the more we're reading and the more we're talking and the more we're cross-fertilising, aspects of our lives, the more likely we are to be able to come up with ideas of our own. And so, I trust kids to be able to think. And so when I go into classrooms, they don't say, I can't think of anything to write about, because they know that I believe that they can think of ideas for themselves. And they do. Sometimes it requires them to go back into their notebooks and look at old words to find new ideas. Sometimes it may be to go and do some more reading or talking. Sometimes it's drawing. It can be any number of pre-writing things that prompt an idea for them to write. And, I often say to them, look, if I can't think of something to write about, the first thing I do is go back into my notebook, and invariably I don't get very far before something pops up.
And I think that's just such a nugget there, Alan, about the intentionally carving out time for students to think.
Correct.
Correct.
That
it's and how, and what do we want to be thinking about? How's that thinking going to, what's going to come into our thoughts? What's going to, I feel the curriculum can sometimes just feel so, and today it's this, and then this, and then this, and the thinking time and valuing that they've got it there. They just need the time.
Absolutely. I met a little girl in a school about 4 years ago who said to me, Alan, my problem isn't thinking up ideas. My problem is that I get so many ideas I don't know which one to choose. Yes, and I thought, what a wonderful dilemma that is.
Yep. Yes. I have to say I well know that one.
So, Alan, can you tell me a bit about writing poetry at different year levels?
Right. Well, I guess it's aligning poetry to the developmental stage that the child's at. And for our least experienced poets, we need to give them some form or structure that makes them feel successful. So I choose short forms such as loons, which involve 11 words, 3, 5 and 3. And the third line has to have a surprise in it. So that's a very accessible form of poetry. We look at things like lisp poetry, which is represented in many cultures, but is a very simple form of creating poetry. So initially, what we might do is create some group poems or class poems together to give them the confidence, and then we might go off and write poetry with a partner. So it's that gradual release of responsibility.
Yep.
Then we start to introduce things like line breaks, the use of repetition and refrains that can be used, and then start to bring in other devices, simile, onomatopoeia, they love that, alliteration. So we can do things that start to add to the complexity of what they're doing. I shy away from rhyming verse because it's probably something that most kids want to write, but they may not have the range of vocab that will enable them to do that initially. And I say to them, I'd really like the fact that you want to write rhyming verse, but I would encourage you to do a lot of reading and expose yourself to lots and lots of synonyms and antonyms and verbs and adjectives and nouns so that you can feel confident that you can go about writing rhyming verse with some confidence. When we do introduce rhyme, it's usually teaching them rhyming couplets, something that is manageable. But from there we go into, complicated poetry forms. I'm thinking of some like ethery poems, which are poems that are in an ascending order from 1 syllable up to 10 syllables in a line. Golden shovel poems that take a line from an existing poem and each of the words in that little extract form the final words on each of the lines. So if you choose a line that's got 6 words, you're going to end up with a 6-line poem. Nonettes, which go from 9 syllables down to 1 syllable, they've all got a structure or a form, but we can also do stuff with a poetry form called triolet, which is a wonderful, it's 6 stanzas, each of them in one sentence, broken up into 3 lines, and that's a lot of fun and quite manageable. And then you get poems like trimeric poems, which are 4 stanzas. The first stanza has 4 lines, and the other 3 stanzas start with the second, third, and fourth line of the first one. So it might sound it's difficult to talk about it without seeing them, but in actual fact, once the kids see them, they can go, oh yes, I can see this, and I can imagine myself writing one of these. So none of those poetry forms require them initially to have to write rhyming verse, and I think that's the critical thing, that they have positive experiences with poetry in the beginning, and this is going right up to even year 10 kids, because kids will say to you, oh look, I've never written poetry, I don't think I can, and you can show them, as Bob Dylan once said, anyone can be a poet. And it's quite true. It's imagining yourself doing something.
Yeah. And really all those forms are allowing, like, rhyme is just one aspect, of poet.
Well, that's why
aspect, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's why I never start talking about poetry and saying, what is poetry? It's better to say, what can poetry do?
Wonderful
what can poetry
question.
do?
Oh.
So, because you'll always get it rhymes. And it's not really telling the full picture.
No, because there's all those things about the sound and
correct,
the focus of it and the rhythm and the
absolutely
and the beat even. That there
but
is.
Paul Kelly talked about rhyme being a memory aid for.
Don't get me wrong.
Through the centuries, but we can go much further than that. But it was a part of handing on stories, wasn't it, a long time ago?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I love writing rhyming verse. In fact, even when I'm trying to write free verse, I've got to be careful because I tend to slip back into rhyme. It's just a natural thing. Yeah. And Paul's right, that whole thing of, particularly in writing musical lyrics, I mean, rhyme is such a critical component in a lot of song lyrics. So I can see why, as he says, he tends to, the majority of his lyrics tend to have a rhyming pattern to them.
Yeah, he just can't help himself. That's
Well,
right.
you can't. I mean,
No.
it's such a natural thing to do. I mean, we grow up with nursery rhymes and all that rhythm and pattern in it, and so it's a logical consequence that we gravitate back towards it.
So going into secondary school, Alan, is it more difficult for kids at the older age? Or
Well, I'm actually look, the great part about it is that once you introduce poetry and you show them, because there's often a cynicism among adolescents about poetry, and particularly I get the question, do you like sport? Because you're writing poetry, and so they think that liking sport and writing poetry are mutually exclusive pursuits or passions. And so then I share with them some of the poetry that I've written around sport. And that immediately brings the barriers down, because you show them that anything can be a subject or a topic for writing. And once you've done that, they're open to suggestion. And of course, once they've felt successful with something, they want more of it. Look, it's a natural thing. We feel energized when we're successful in doing something, and we want to do it again. And I can recall working with a group of kids who it was a very low functioning group of kids in a school in Brooklyn, and I introduced them to list poems. Well, for the next 6 weeks, every time I walked into that room, can we do more of the list poems? So I knew that I'd done something that they felt successful with. So, yeah, it's so important that initial experience, and that's why a lot of teachers have shied away from poetry. They've had a bad experience with it, and, it's that aversion therapy. I don't want to go back there. It wasn't fun the last time.
Yeah. And, in fact, just by mentioning all those different types of, the different forms today has really, I think, well, for me, there are definitely some of those forms I've never heard of. And so that then, this is what expands and opens the doors for us as teachers too, to go, there's more that I can be looking at here, and more that I can be exploring as teacher and as writer.
All of those forms are on my Poetry Pizzazz page, because that's
fabulous.
I've done a lot of work in exploring it, particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, because I had the time. It was a chance to explore and go deeper. And mind you, I'm also part of a group called Poetry Friday, and that's an international group of poets. And some of those people that are involved in that, they've also introduced me to other forms of poetry. So it's quite a creative group, and we're trying to stimulate each other to go into new areas of poetry. So it's been wonderful.
Oh, I will definitely be pizzazzing myself, looking at that, and certainly encouraging people to go exploring. And, in the physical sense of looking for other things, but then trying that out as writers as well.
Absolutely.
When you craft a poem, or a student crafts a poem, or a teacher, is it letting your subconscious and your pen take you? Is it, what do you think it is?
Yes, it's interesting. Some people have that thing of let it go where it wants to go, and sometimes I do that. I have a tendency to spend a lot of time in my head rehearsing. I rehearse words. It's like Terry Denton, who lives around the corner from me. Terry once said to me, "It's like you've got a giant tumble dryer in your head, and the words and ideas are going around and around and around, and when they're ready, we take them out and we spill them onto the page." And that's what I do. I sometimes I get into trouble because there's this rich world that's happening in my head that is taking me away from the moment that I should be in. And but it's rough idea about what I want to craft. Mind you, when the words come out onto the page, they don't always fall where you want them to, or they don't look like you imagine them in your head. So you then go back, and there's two things here that I wanted to mention. One is that when the best word fits into the right place, I use the analogy of Lego, because there's that little click when a piece falls into the right place, and it's the same with writing poetry. Suddenly the right word clicks into place, and you know it that instant that that's where it needs to be. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that we also have to be prepared to distance ourselves from the words. In other words, I'll say this to kids, don't force the issue too much. Put it away, do something else, read, take the dog for a walk, go and play a game, help someone else, but come back to it and look at it through fresh eyes and look at it again closely and see what needs to change. And I do that. I practice that myself, and I heard you saying earlier, Sharon, about the necessity to hear poetry. We really need to read our poetry out loud. In the classroom, I encourage kids to read to the walls and windows before you even attempt to get someone else to read your poetry. It's a courtesy that we extend to our fellow writers, and we say, right, if it comes off our tongue easily, we're doing okay. If they're tripping over our tongue, we've got a problem and we need to attend to it. So that whole notion of being responsible for your words and making sure that the very best words are being squeezed into tight spaces, because then we create some sparks. And that's what poetry's all about.
Oh, words in tight spaces create sparks. Oh, Alan, that was the most gorgeous sentence.
I think that's a bit of gold there on the whole thinking and processes. That what you're actually doing when you're writing. I mean, I guess it's different for different people, but
absolutely.
But such a valuable insight on what's going through your head.
I think teachers are starting to open up more about this. They're showing a greater willingness to be brave writers themselves, and I think even the introduction of the writer's notebook for teachers, I think that's made them more aware of the need to, lead the way into this writing world for their students. It's mostly attitudinal. If we've got the right attitude to writing and we're showing them that we're valuing the very thing we're asking them to do, they're more likely to come with us on that journey. It follows. So I think we're starting to see more and more teachers willing to be brave writers themselves and to try things. And they're also understanding the struggle that kids have as a consequence of trying various genres. And I think that's a really important revelatory, understanding that they're developing. Also that you're talking about your struggle, your process, what you discovered and how you dealt with the problems that arose in your writing. That's just as important as the writing itself.
Yes.
So that kids, that they understand that this is the process that you went through, that you persisted, didn't give up, you kept trying, and this is what's resulted, and this is what I've learned from this, and this is what I will do differently next time, and this is what I will continue to do because it really worked. All of those sort of understandings and sharing of information is vitally important.
And it can change your relationship with your children,
Absolutely. If you want credibility as a teacher of writing, you've got to get in there. You've got to roll up your sleeves and you've got to have a go yourself.
Yes, yeah. Yep. And so through giving insights into our writer's life really does the empowering, doesn't it, for our students entering a writer's life. and I really like that you talked about, that we need to be giving as many insights into that as we would into, a particular format or structure or craft aspect, that it is what it is. What are the struggles that a writer faces and overcomes? And, that's building stamina, but it's also building just an expanse of possibilities as writer, because otherwise the struggle stops us.
But particularly today, poetry writing, because it's such a powerful form of writing that needs a really great amount of exploration in our classrooms.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
And, it's like many things that once you've got it for life.
Yeah.
I meet people, that have been writing poetry secretly all their lives.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting.
It is probably. Do you think it would be the most secret of all forms?
Oh, I think it is. I think it is. Again, it's breaking down the notion that poetry is some elitist form of writing, and the mythology that surrounds all that is really important, that we do make it accessible, and so
it's for anybody. It's for anybody. Yeah.
Oh, for adult and kids, for anybody. You're right.
Yep.
You're right.
And do you think maybe even our perception about poetry has been in its, in reading it, where it always seems that, in the teaching of it, we then have to explain, and then I'm sitting there as the child thinking, I didn't get that out of that piece of writing. That clearly I don't understand how poetry works. That to me sometimes, well, maybe that's just my not.
No, I think you're right, Sharon. I think that we can sort of force the meaning of something and impose it upon someone else, and it's a bit like I can liken it to wine. I can tell you that I really enjoyed that wine. You might drink it and think, oh, it doesn't hold that same appeal to me. And that's exactly the same with poetry. And there are poems that I read that I go, oh, well, yes, okay, that's okay, but it's not something that immediately connects with me. And yet I'll read something else and go, wow.
Yeah.
I really love those words. I love those words. So it's a personal thing.
Yes.
It really is a personal thing.
Hence,
and our takeaways are different,
Hence we need a big collection in our classrooms to choose from.
Vital.
Vital.
Yeah, vital. Yeah.
All right. I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks, Alan. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for your insights in all that. There's so many bits of gold in there for teachers to take away, and we'll provide all the links to the different things that were mentioned.
Can I just take a moment to read a short little poem?
Oh yes,
oh certainly,
certainly.
From What the Poems to Found, my latest book.
Oh and yes, thank you, Alan.
It links into I guess what we've been talking about, because it's called The Words That Come at Night.
Right.
Sometimes the words of unwritten poems slide into bed next to me. They nestle on my pillow and whisper in my ear. Write me down, remember me in tomorrow's early light. Soft echoes at the edge of sleep implore me to commit to memory sweet refrains and edgy fragments, these faint murmurings, these wannabe words of unwritten poems, settle as cobweb fine, final thoughts, last visitors before sleep swallows the room. Thank you.
Oh, that was
Alan,
fabulous.
A very appropriate way to, well, we would love to continue conversation around here and writing. But that, as we said, was from What the Poems to Found. And
yes,
that's one of your poems.
Correct.
Yes. So this is an anthology, What the Poems to Found. Are they all yours?
Yes.
They are.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Beautiful. Right. So if that one's not in school libraries, It should be.
Yeah.
I wish. Thank you.
And if we can help teachers out there, and Alan can help teachers out there find bigger collections of poems, please contact us. Either contact Alan or contact us, and we'll try and send you. But in the show notes, there will be the links to the things we've mentioned today. So
Yes. Yeah.
now, Alan, some rapid fire questions for you. What was your favourite book as a child, and why?
Well, it's still on my bookshelf and it's staring at me right now, and it's called The Complete Adventures of Blinky Bill.
Oh,
Right.
Our teacher read it to us, I think, in about grade 2, and I just had to have my own copy of it. And so did all the other kids. It was a bit like the treehouse stories of this generation.
yes.
Everybody had to have it. And so Blinky Bill, and when I open it up now and I look at the writing, and I think Dorothy Wall wrote that in 1930, it's still, the language, it's beautiful writing. It's really well written. So I can see why it appealed.
Oh,
Yeah.
fabulous. And so your teacher, year 2, read that to you. So
Yes.
there's the power of it, isn't it? If we
Absolutely.
The power of read aloud.
if we ever wanted
definitely.
confirmation of our power as teachers, you know, we don't often hear back from our students about those things, but you know, that was certainly my experience too. That, you know, what teachers read to me is exactly what I wanted to have copies of for myself.
Yeah, so powerful. Now, what's your most interesting school story?
I've got a couple there. There was the one, I mean, I loved when a teacher read Rikki Tikki Tavi. I couldn't wait to get more of that story. It was so engrossing. And the battles of the mongoose with the cobras, brilliantly written, and a story that was just right for. I think I was in about grade 3 or 4 when Mr. Murphy, our teacher, read that to us. The other thing that has stuck to me like glue all through my life, when I was in my first year of school, my teacher. This was in an era where left-handers were. Scolded for being left-handed and told I was told, you need to write with your right hand because you'll never be a neat writer. And I've dedicated my entire life to proving Mrs. Bartlett wrong. So I get criticised because my notebooks are exceedingly neat. And I think that's really interesting. I'm not a fast writer, I'm slow, but I am meticulous and I am careful, and I take great pride in being a left-hander who can write very, very neatly. So, Mrs. Bartlett,
Yep.
here's a raspberry.
Now, how do you think you learned to read, Alan?
That was an interesting one because when I look back, I was scared of, I remember my grandmother buying me Treasure Island, and it just looked so big and overwhelming. I felt like it, I would have become exhausted and run out of breath trying to read it. But I had this passion for sport, and I used to read sporting results in the paper. And there's the example of someone reading with a definite interest and an authentic purpose. I wanted to know. I wanted to know how the sporting contest turned out. And so I think that was part of what got me going as a reader and gave me the confidence to then tackle what I called big books.
Yeah.
And there we have it. You love sport and poetry.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think Richard Allington talked about his daughters all being good readers, but then the son came along and he was struggling, and at year 4, I think a teacher turned him onto computer magazines, and it just changed his whole life.
Yeah, I guess our quest as teachers is to find the key, find the way in. What is it that will turn this particular child into a reader?
Yes.
You're right.
Yeah.
And so Richard's right too in what he said there.
That's right. Now, the best question you love to ask teachers.
What will your students see you doing and hear you saying? Because it's not it's in our actions, it's in our attitude, and they need to, know that you are there as an advocate for their learning. And it's so important that they see you saying things that will facilitate that.
That's a fantastic way of saying it. Best question you love to ask students?
Well, because I do a lot of work now with helping kids to become better writers, the question I'm always asking is, what are you reading now that is like what you're trying to write? Because I've often find that there's a disconnect between what kids are writing and what they're reading. I had a conversation with a girl, grade 6 writer, and I said, "What are you writing currently?" She said, "I'm writing a horror story." And I said to her, "Oh, so that suggests that at the moment you're reading a lot of horror story books?" "No," she said. It wasn't something that she'd considered. And so there's this giant disconnect often between what kids are writing and what they're reading. And so, in having this huge collection of poetry books and continuing to add to it, I've got to feed the need. So if I'm writing poetry, I need to be reading a lot of poetry. If I want to write horror stories, I need to be reading a lot of Stephen King. It's logical, or Edgar Allan Poe. It's so important that we narrow that gap between what kids are writing and what they're reading.
It probably goes back to that thing of having this, building up that really rich resource of poetry in your classroom, but then you're modelling to the students how to use that literature in your writing, and then they see what it's about. It's
modelling it and teaching them to be reading like a writer.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Best tip for thriving in teaching literacy or poetry?
Become a living, breathing advocate for what you want your young learners to become. It's so important that, if I want these kids to become lifelong readers and writers, then I have to present as a lifelong reader and writer. I have to make my reading and writing life visible to them every single day. And every time I step into a classroom, I have to be an advocate for all of those things. And every teacher needs to really do that, because that's what sustains you. And I mean, after 50 years of being an educator, one of the things that pleases me is that people say, "You're still so very enthusiastic about what you do." And I say, well, you shouldn't be here unless you are enthusiastic. It's too important not to be enthusiastic. But you're right. I get just as much of a buzz out of working with a group of kids and helping them to believe in themselves as learners as I did when I first started out in teaching. And that was the same year that Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. So it was a while ago.
Oh.
Fantastic.
And do you think that, you'd probably say too that you may even have more enthusiasm
possibly,
for some of these things, but maybe might it be that the reading and the writing that you've done have been part of that breath for you? That
I would agree, Sharon. I think I talked before about when you feel confident about something, it gives you an energy, and I think I've developed I guess an energy and a self-belief around reading and writing that has grown my confidence, and I think I take that with me.
Yes.
I often say to kids, every time you step into your classroom, I want you to bring all the reading and writing you've ever done and make that impact what you're doing today.
Oh.
Simple as that.
Fantastic.
Simple and as glorious as that. That's magnificent.
Thank you, Alan, so much for helping us make a giant leap for all students today and taking a step onto the moon of poetry. That was a bit of poetry there. But no, thank you so much.
You need to write that down.
Yeah, I do. But thank you so much and for everything you're doing for teachers and students out there. It's just amazing. And your huge contribution over many years too.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share a little of the passion and the journey. It's always lovely to talk about something that that gives you great joy.
Yeah.
And I think it was Don Holloway said that we have to be joyfully literate when we go into classrooms, and hopefully that's what I represent when I go into classrooms.
It's exactly what you do, Alan. Yeah. Exactly. So very grateful for you sharing, really digging into your wealth of experience, both as writer and as fellow teacher, in all of this that you bring to us today. And for our listeners, there's lots that they can follow up with, both on your blogs and Facebook page and the show notes that we'll make links to, and your books.
Yeah.
Let's get them into libraries, classroom libraries and school libraries.
Yep.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And everyone develop your collections in your own classrooms. Fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today in the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you or speaking to you next week. And thank you especially to our co-host Sharon, and most especially to Alan. Thank you very much, Alan.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank everybody. Bye.
Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.